Pizza Pie Puzzler. A Felicia's Food Truck. Book 3. By Celia Kinsey, writing as Abby Byne. You are listening to an AI-narrated full audio mystery. If you'd rather read this story, there is a link to the ebook in the description. Chapter 1. It wasn't until Antonio's pizza truck had been parked a block from Whispering Palms Senior Living Complex for nearly a week that I discovered who'd been poaching our customers. Usually, by the time the middle of the afternoon rolls around, there are at least $400 in the till. For the previous week, we'd been getting the normal tourist crowd, but our usual glut of senior diners had slowed to a trickle. I finally asked Prue, a sweet but loopy inhabitant of Whispering Palms, why all her fellow residents had suddenly lost interest in our hamburgers, fries, and chili dogs. Antonio gives out a senior discount plus a handful of free bottle rockets with every pizza, Prue said. Bottle rockets? Do you mean a free bottle of pop, by chance? Nope, I mean bottle rockets, Prue insisted. You know, shui bang. You haven't lived until you've witnessed a bird-like woman of mature years wearing enormous white sneakers and a blue rinse recreate the sound a bottle rocket makes. I was still wiping tears of laughter from my eyes when Prue said, "Does your cheeseburger come with cheese, or is that extra?" I assured Prue that cheeseburgers, by nature, came with cheese. It was right there in the name. Then I asked who Antonio was. Antonio of Antonio's Pizza Kitchen, Prue said. Did a new restaurant open in Bray Bay? Antonio's Mobile Pizza Kitchen, I should have said. It's just a dinky little truck. Antonio parked it in the vacant lot right next to the complex. He sells pizza out of his truck? How does he bake it? Antonio has this little trailer with a pizza oven on it, Prue explained. I don't care for pizza myself, but the other residents all rave about it. My cook, Arnie, half turned from the grill where he'd started on the patty. Prue hadn't yet settled on the cheeseburger, but based on previous experience, there was a 98% chance she'd change her mind 3 or 4 times before returning to her original selection. Just how much of a senior discount is this Antonio giving out? I asked. Prue didn't know. I thought Arnie looked more on edge than was warranted from a little competition, but at the time, I chalked up his scowl to worry. Our food truck wasn't doing particularly well, not that it ever raked in the dough. Arnie blamed our constant cash flow problems on my propensity to give away food, but the truth is, it's hard to turn a profit in food service, even considering the smaller overhead that comes along with working out of a truck in a vacant parking lot next to a car wash. I think I'll wander over there and see just how wonderful this Antonio's pizza is, I told Arnie. Arnie did not protest, so I left him to finish off Prue's cheeseburger and walked the 3 blocks over to Whispering Palms. Antonio's Mobile Pizza Kitchen was certainly ideally situated to cater to the senior residents of the retirement complex. According to several of our regulars from Whispering Palms, the on-site dining room typically served up gray meat, soggy green beans, gluey mashed potatoes, and tasteless low-sodium gravy followed by tiny portions of sugar-free gelatin intended to pass as dessert. Despite the promotional literature touting carefully crafted cuisine tailored to the nutritional needs of the active senior, I'd yet to hear one inmate of Whispering Palms with a positive word to say about the menu. I suspected that the promotional literature was more to reassure the nervous children of the retirees than to appeal to potential residents. The old folks themselves seemed to subscribe more to the philosophy that they didn't have a lot of time left, and eating was one of the few remaining pleasures they still possessed the full capacity to enjoy. A sensible stance to take, in my opinion, but not likely to be soothing to the fretful adult child worried about dad's high cholesterol or mom's erratic blood sugar readings. I paused in front of Antonio's Mobile Pizza Kitchen and watched the queue of our regulars, waiting for a chance to make their own pizza. It was a clever concept, I had to admit. On a low table next to the food truck was an array of toppings. The procedure was, you gave your order at the window of the food truck, and Antonio handed you out a raw, sauce-covered crust on a peel, then you took your pizza over to the toppings table and piled it high with whatever you wanted. When you'd finished loading up your crust, Antonio took your pizza and baked it in the little mobile oven mounted on a tiny trailer he pulled behind his truck. It was an ingenious idea. I wished I'd thought of it. The only drawback was that the whole process took forever. Still, when you are dealing with diners who have little to do but play cards until their pickleball court becomes available, waiting isn't such a big deal. Antonio saw me loitering on the outskirts of the small crowd of seniors and called out to me. "What can I do for you, beautiful?" "I don't like flirts. When you grow up tall, gangly, and red-haired, I didn't stop growing until I was closing in on 6 feet. You tend to suspect mockery when a random stranger calls you beautiful." Besides, I felt Antonio's assessment of my personal appearance was wholly irrelevant to whether I wanted a pizza or not. "I want to order a pizza," I said stiffly. "You know it wouldn't hurt you to smile a little," said Antonio, sealing his fate as an A1 louse in my book. I hate when people order me to smile. Smiles should never be compulsory unless one is acting in a toothpaste commercial. I deliberately turned down the corners of my mouth and waited while Antonio smeared a pizza crust with marinara sauce. After he handed it out to me, I took it over to the table and put on toppings, black olives, bell peppers, and onions on half, for Arnie, and mushrooms and pepperoni on the other half, for me. The menu board proclaimed that my medium pizza would set me back $14.99, so I whispered to Fitz, a Whispering Palms resident who was loading up his pizza next to me, "How much is the senior discount?" "A medium is $7.99. I couldn't be sure without pricing out Antonio's ingredients, but it seemed to me that the pizzas were going to seniors at a substantial loss. "How often do you eat here?" I asked. I think Fitz took it as a rebuke because he got a little defensive. "You know we're all on a fixed income," he said. "Besides, the pizza is delicious. Plus, Antonio gives out great stock tips. He's an investing genius." I couldn't help wondering why an investing genius was slaving away baking pizzas, but I couldn't deny that the pizza was delicious. Even I had to admit that. Back at the food truck, Arnie and I sat down at a table normally reserved for customers, of whom there were none, and ate the whole thing. "What are we going to do?" I asked Arnie when we'd finished our 3 enormous slices each. "We'll just have to wait it out," he said. "Antonio can't go on operating at a loss indefinitely." That was true. Antonio couldn't keep his business open if it was hemorrhaging cash, but neither could we. What we'd taken in today didn't even cover the pittance I paid to Hank, who owned the car wash next door, for the privilege of parking on his land. "What did you think of Antonio?" Arnie asked after a long silence. Chapter 2. Antonio firmly believes he is charming. I firmly disagree, I told Arnie as we sat surveying the empty pizza box. Arnie broke out in a broad grin, unaccountably cheerful after we'd been sitting there brooding for the last half hour on how our business was going down the drain. "I'm glad you take a sensible view," said Arnie. "Some women of my acquaintance have been taken in by Antonio." "Oh, what women are you referring to?" "I'd rather not talk about it." "So you know Antonio?" I persisted. "Antonio Scarpello and I went to high school together." "He's a local?" "Yeah." "Why haven't I seen him around?" "He's been in prison." "For what?" "Running some sort of scam." "I never looked into it. I was just happy to have him gone." "Why?" Arnie fell silent. He clearly didn't want to talk about whatever history he had with Antonio. My money was on an ex-girlfriend being involved, but I could count Arnie's girlfriends on the one hand. He was the sort to stay friends with his exes, and I knew them all. Not one of the women seemed the type to be taken in by the likes of Antonio Scarpello, even as a high school student. I was trying to decide whether to persist in my interrogation when a couple of our regulars showed up. Marge and Bobby aren't regulars in the sense that they regularly buy from us. They are more regulars in the sense of always being around. Marge used to sleep on the porch of the old house in downtown Bray Bay that serves as the town's public library, but ever since she and Bobby became an item, I don't see her there anymore. Maybe they spend nights down in the grove of trees by the beach. There's also a mountain bike park down there. There's nothing remotely resembling a mountain for hundreds of miles, but a few years back, a group of local bikers got together and created a labyrinth of hillocks, jumps, and obstacles. A lot of homeless people camp out in the grove surrounding the bike park. Last year there was a holdup at the food truck, and for a while, Bobby was implicated. I didn't buy that theory from the start, and ever since I helped track down the real robber, Marge and Bobby have gone out of their way to show their appreciation by keeping me informed of all the happenings around Bray Bay, at least of the sort that never makes it into the Bay Bray Crier. I have a sneaking suspicion Marge and Bobby have also altered their daily rounds so that they stop by the food truck in the evenings, after we close and again in the early morning before we open just to make sure nobody's messing with anything. During the day, Bobby and Marge often stop by for water and a chat. Sometimes Marge will insist on buying our cheapest burger and a small fry which she splits down the middle with Bobby. Because we're always drinking your water, she'll say. I like having Marge and Bobby around. It makes me feel secure somehow to know that no matter where I am in Bray Bay, a friend may pop around the corner or out of the bushes. It's like having your own 24-hour shadow security. How would you guys like to have all-you-can-eat hot dogs on the house? I asked Marge. I looked over at Arnie, and for once, he wasn't making faces at me for giving away food. The hot dog vat was on the verge of having to be tossed, we'd sold so few, and Arnie hates waste. Oh, I couldn't do that, said Marge. Let me pay. Not necessary. By the end of the day tomorrow, we'll have to throw them all away anyway, I told her. I'd much rather someone ate them. Arnie and I would join you in a hot dog feast, except we just ate a whole pizza. Pizza? Marge had a funny look on her face. I went and tried out that new pizza truck down by Whispering Palms, I said, trying to look cheerful. Have to keep an eye on the competition, you know. I don't like that guy, said Marge. He threatened to call the police on Bobby. Why? Bobby refilled his water bottle at the cooler without buying anything. That pizza guy came out and yelled at him and said if he caught Bobby anywhere near his truck, he'd have him arrested. What did Antonio plan to have Bobby arrested for? I asked. I don't think reporting someone for stealing water would impress the police much. Bobby had been hanging around in the background, looking like he wished Marge would just shut up about the whole thing. He didn't say why he'd have me arrested, Bobby said. He did, too, say, Marge insisted. Marge isn't one to get angry, but her face was red, and her hands were shaking. Antonio said he'd have Bobby arrested for vagrancy and trespassing, and if necessary, he'd make something up. She turned to Bobby. Tell them what that guy called you. I'd rather not repeat it, Bobby said. It's better just to ignore people like that. As long as you stay out of their way. It was quiet for the rest of the day. We closed early and went home before 7. The next morning I came early to open. That's usually Arnie's department, but he had his sister Hannah's 12-year-old daughter Sammy and 9-year-old son Porter staying over so Hannah could take a much-needed girls' night out. Arnie has this tradition where he feeds his nieces and nephews an elaborate waffle breakfast whenever they stay over. You can't rush waffles or a chatterbox 12-year-old. When I arrived, Marge was sitting at one of the tables waiting for me. It happened again, she said without even saying hello. Yesterday evening, Bobby was just walking by the pizza truck. He was all the way on the other side of the street and everything, but Antonio started yelling at him. Oh. What was Antonio yelling? You know that homeless man who got beaten up by that gang of teenagers over in Eagles Rest a couple of months ago? Marge asked. Well, Antonio threatened Bobby with that and worse, those were his exact words. I would have asked Marge more questions, but Arnie arrived with Frank. Frank is Arnie's grumpy geriatric dachshund who slumbers away the day under the truck. Frank went straight to his favorite spot between the front wheels, turned around a couple of times, and lay down again, only to suddenly stand up, the hair on the back of his neck bristling. At first, I thought it was Arnie's agitated manner after hearing a repeat of Marge's tale about Antonio that had gotten Frank riled, but then I realized we had customers, paying ones this time. Emmeline and her dog Buddy are two of our faithful regulars. I'm always happy to see Emmeline, but Frank does not like Buddy, and the feeling is mutual. Usually, it's just Emmeline and Buddy who stop by to eat, but today they brought a friend. This is Tanisha, Emmeline said. She's just moved back to town, and I told her she had to try your burgers. Tanisha was the smiley sort, but I mean that in a good way. While she waited for Arnie to grill the burgers, She went on and on about how cute our food truck was and how nice it was to be back in Bray Bay and how nice the weather was, and how much she was looking forward to going down to the beach after work. "Where do you work?" I asked when she finally took a breath. Chapter 3. I work in the Whispering Palms Enhanced Care Wing, Tanisha told me. I'm a CNA. I love it. The Enhanced Care Wing is where the powers that be at Whispering Palms send residents when they can't safely live on their own, in an apartment anymore. It came as no surprise that Tanisha loved her job. She seemed to take a universally sunny view of everything. I imagined she regularly attempted to make flossing her teeth and sorting junk mail exercises in positivity. "So you came back for a job?" I asked. "I came back to be near my dad. He moved into an apartment at Whispering Palms about 6 months ago. It was LaShawn, my fiancé, who got a job here first. He's a CNA, too." "That must be convenient for you and LaShawn to both work in the same place," Emmeline said. "It's just a shame about your ex, though." For the first time since I'd met her, Tanisha's smile slipped a little. Arnie had set to work grilling the burgers and begun, unasked, to assemble a chili dog for Marge. "Does your ex work at Whispering Palms too?" I asked Tanisha. "No. He's parked his food truck across the street." Ouch. Arnie had dropped a full ladle of hot chili on his foot, but he wasn't even bothering to pick it up. He was all ears. "Antonio?" I asked. Tanisha nodded. Arnie was over the counter now, making every effort not to miss whatever Tanisha might say next. "You used to date Antonio?" I asked. "We used to be married." I wanted to express my deepest sympathies, but since I'd just met the woman, that seemed a little over the top, so I just said, "That must be awkward." "Oh, we get along okay," Tanisha said. "As long as your dad doesn't come around," Emmeline chimed in. I made a mental note not to confide in Emmeline about any deeply personal matters. I could see that Tanisha didn't much like her family conflicts being aired to strangers, and I couldn't say I blamed her. "Oh, I don't think Dad means Antonio any harm," Tanisha said. "He's just protective of me. To him, I'll always be a little girl." Tanisha had completely deflated, like a beach ball that had sprung a leak. I went over to the counter and picked up Emmeline and Tanisha's burgers, directed them to a table, and changed the subject by asking if they were planning on making it to the Bray Bay Municipal Fireworks on the 4th. Apparently, the city had gotten a grant for a new and improved display this year, and rumor had it that some of the pyrotechnics would be spectacular. I never got my answer about Tanisha and Emmeline's Independence Day plans because we were suddenly descended upon by a small crowd of ravenous Whispering Palms residents clamoring for burgers and fries. "What happened?" I asked as I took orders so Arnie could concentrate his efforts on filling them. "The pizza truck didn't open today," Fitz, a staunch bratwurst and hot mustard man, informed me. "Antonio just pulled down the shutters on the truck and told us to go home." "Why?" I asked. "Did he have a personal emergency or something?" There must have been at least a dozen retirees who descended en masse. "Don't know why he didn't open," said Fitz. "I know, Patsy, extra pickles, and an aversion to lettuce," chimed in from the back of the line. "Somebody dumped out all the toppings onto the ground. I saw it myself." "You mean somebody just walked up to the table and started tipping over containers?" Fitz asked. "Was it Marcella Edwards?" Marcella, sweet relish and extra onions, had a reputation for being unhinged and seemed to be getting more unhinged all the time. My money was on an undiagnosed brain tumor or something, but when I'd floated that theory to Prue, she'd insisted Marcella's behavior was nothing more than mild senility combined with a lifelong disregard for the comfort and safety of others, although Prue's explanation of the situation was considerably less concise than that. Prue suffers from mild cognitive impairment herself, so I guess she's qualified to recognize the signs. "It wasn't Marcella," Patsy insisted. "When Antonio went to put the containers out, they weren't there. He found all the toppings dumped out in that row of bushes between Whispering Palms and where he parks his truck. There was a steady stream of retirees right up through the supper hour. Our regulars were back, without a hint of embarrassment for having up and taken their business elsewhere for the last week. It was after 8 when the last customers departed, and I sent Arnie home for the evening. It wasn't until I was pulling down the shutters over the window that I realized what a relief it was to have our regulars back. I was just inserting the padlocks in the shutters when a man rode up on a mountain bike that looked like it cost more than your average hatchback. He was dressed head to toe in the most complete suit of protective body armor I'd ever seen. He skidded to a stop in front of me. I forgot all about my closing up routine when the biker took off his full-face helmet. It was Antonio Scarpello of Antonio's Mobile Pizza Kitchen. Chapter 4. Antonio started yelling before he even got his helmet off, which made him hard to understand. I won't actually relate what he yelled, but the upshot, omitting all the obscenities and the hard-to-understand bits while he still had the helmet on his head, was that Antonio believed Arnie and I were responsible for dumping out his toppings into the bushes. "I've filed a police report," he said when he finally wound down. "What makes you think we had anything to do with it?" I demanded. "Isn't it obvious?" "Not exactly. All your customers have switched over to me," Antonio pointed out. "But for how long?" I said. "I'll admit your pizza is delicious, but you can't possibly even be breaking even. Just because your business is failing due to mismanagement, that doesn't mean mine is. You're just sabotaging me out of spite." That sounded rather more like what I suspected Antonio of doing. It probably wouldn't do a bit of good, but I decided to come right out with my suspicions. "I don't think this has anything to do with who is poaching whose customers. What exactly do you have against Arnie?" I demanded. "Clearly, there's bad blood between you. He talked Hannah into leaving me." "Hannah? Arnie's sister Hannah? We used to be married for a while until that." Antonio let loose a string of insults that made me want to rethink my strict philosophy of nonviolence. Halfway through Antonio's tirade, I realized I was gripping the keys for the padlock so hard they were digging into my palm. "You okay?" said a voice over my left shoulder. "This guy bothering you?" I turned. It was Hank from the car wash next door. Hank's not usually a threatening figure. For one thing, he's well past 60 and skinny as a rail, but the way he was fingering the front of his denim jacket he wears regardless of the weather made me wonder if he wasn't contemplating whipping out a firearm and ordering Antonio off the property. "I've called the police," Hank said, hand poised to reach inside his jacket. "It's okay, Hank," I told him. "I'm not in any danger." Hank didn't seem too sure Antonio wasn't any threat to me, and Antonio didn't seem too sure Hank wasn't any threat to him. If I hadn't already battened down the hatches on the truck, I'd have offered free fries all around to defuse the situation. Hank and Antonio were still staring each other down when a police car tore into the lot and screeched to a halt so quickly that we all got sprayed with gravel. Officer Scott Finch jumped out. Scott used to be my boyfriend way back when, and until relatively recently, he never got over it. He's finally come to terms with the fact we're never getting back together, but he still has a soft spot for me, and right now, he was transparently worried about my safety. "What's going on here?" Scott demanded. "Are you harassing this lady?" "Harassing her?" Antonio said. That's a laugh. "It's more like the other way around." "What do you mean by that?" "She and her partner are trying to put me out of business." "I'm afraid I don't follow." "Somebody dumped out all my pizza toppings in the bushes this morning, so I couldn't even open." "I'm sure they did it." "Did you see them do it?" Scott asked. I thought this was a perfectly reasonable question, but Antonio appeared to take it as a personal affront. He turned purple with rage. "Yes," he said. Officer Finch looked taken aback. "Are you claiming to have seen, with your own eyes, who dumped out the toppings?" I interrupted. For a few long seconds, I thought for sure the man was going to accuse me to my face, but I guess he lost his nerve. "It was Arnie," he said. "Just Arnie?" Scott pressed. "Yeah, just Arnie." "Then why are you here yelling at Miss Finnegan?" Officer Finch demanded. "Have you filed a police report?" "Yes." "Well, I'll take a look at it and see what I can do," Scott said. In the meantime, I'd suggest you stay well away from Miss Finnegan. Antonio didn't stick around after that. He shoved his substantial helmet back on his head and pedaled away as if he was being pursued by an angry flock of flamingos. I can't imagine Arnie doing a thing like that, I told Scott as we watched Antonio pedal past the car wash and disappear around the corner. I'll go straight to the station and take a look at the report, Scott said. Want to ride along? In years past, I would have refused the offer, but now that Scott and I had an understanding, I was comfortable saying yes. On the way down to the station, Scott asked me, "So, you and Arnie made it official yet?" I must have turned the color of an overripe tomato because Scott started laughing so hard I worried his vision might be impaired by his tears of mirth. His amusement only made me more embarrassed. The truth was, I hadn't even gotten up the nerve to broach the subject with Arnie. I wasn't in any hurry to alter the status of our relationship. There was a very real risk that Arnie's feelings for me were purely platonic, and I didn't want to ruin my friendship with the best friend I'd ever had. You do know that man is crazy about you, Scott said as we pulled into the parking lot at the station. I may have huffed, or possibly growled, as I hastily exited the passenger seat of the patrol car before Scott could say any more on the subject. Inside the station, Officer Finch pulled up the police report. It described the incident just as our crowd of hungry regulars had. There's no mention of Arnie at all, I pointed out. Mr. Scarpello clearly stated that he discovered the toppings had been dumped 20 minutes after he arrived at the food truck, Scott said. He also stated that he had no idea who might have dumped them. Antonio will have a very hard time pinning the vandalism on Arnie since it clearly contradicts what he told police at the scene. I should have felt relieved, but I didn't. Arnie had mentioned something about Antonio having just gotten out of prison. When I told Scott, he seemed to be hearing this for the first time. He tapped away at the desk computer for a few minutes. Fraud, Scott told me. Antonio Scarpello served 18 months in state prison for fraud. I don't know what the story behind his conviction was all about without looking into it further, which I will, but I'm betting a simple internet search of news stories would tell you most of what you need to know. When scammers get caught, it tends to capture the public's imagination. I stayed up late that night, poring over news articles. Scott had been right about the case stimulating a great deal of public interest. It seemed that Antonio Scarpello had been the ringleader in a scheme to bilk a large number of retirees out of their life savings. He'd done it by selling them units in a non-existent condominium community in Costa Rica. Antonio had used photographs of the construction of someone else's development to keep the investors mollified through endless fabricated delays and setbacks, but the scheme had finally caught up to him when he tried to con his own father-in-law, who'd ended up instigating an investigation into Antonio's scheme. I thought back to Emmeline's comment to Tanisha about how Antonio and Tanisha's father didn't get along. It couldn't be Arnie and Hannah's father who'd been involved. He'd been dead for 10 years. Perhaps, however, there was yet another ex-wife. It was so late when I finally drifted off into a fitful sleep that I was half an hour late getting to the food truck. When I arrived, I was surprised to see a crowd of regulars queued up at the window. Did Antonio's not open again today? I asked Prue, who was hanging around at the back of the line, trying to decide between tuna on rye or chili cheese fries. It was Pooh this time, said Prue. Prue tends to use the wrong words sometimes, so I tried again. What do you mean by a Pooh? Surely you know what Pooh is, said Prue. I don't like to use that other word people call it. I think that's crude. Chapter 5. When Prue says poo, Patsy chimed in, she means exactly that. Horse poo, to be exact, said Fitz, then started laughing so hard he had to pause before he could go on. Somebody put horse do inside the pizza oven. When Antonio fired it up, it made a terrible stink, said Prue. I don't know how he's ever going to clean it, Patsy added. He had to close up for the day, obviously. I'd heard of some creative acts of vandalism in my time, but putting horse poo in a pizza oven took the cow pie. Does Antonio have any idea who did it? I asked. The line got suddenly silent. Nobody said a word. He's telling you all Arnie did it, isn't he? I whispered to Prue. Yes, she said. But don't worry. Nobody believes a word of it. The lunch hour passed without incident other than we were busier than we'd ever been. Evidently, Antonio's smear campaign against Arnie was having the opposite of his intended effect. During the mid-afternoon lull, I walked down to the Pick and Quick on the corner, bought Arnie and myself each a cold drink and loitered out front to make a phone call. What I had to say was too complicated to communicate by text. I have a question about your friend Tanisha, I told Emmeline as soon as she picked up. Her ex-husband Antonio has been. I didn't know how to describe what Antonio had been doing. I didn't have to. Say no more, Emmeline told me. I don't know if Tanisha will be willing to talk to you, but I'll ask her and pass on your number. That afternoon, Arnie left early to take his nephew, Porter, to swimming lessons. I was just contemplating calling it a day when a family of Texan tourists with 9 children all crammed into an enormous van, pulled up on the lot. They all piled out and queued up at the window in order of age. A maroon sedan containing the world's most indecisive elderly gentleman pulled in right behind them. I got the Texans squared away in record time. You're not allowed to be indecisive in a family that big, otherwise, you run the risk of someone else making your decisions for you. It was hot dogs, burgers, and fries all around. The mother of the troop was the only dissenting voice. She ordered tuna on rye with a side of coleslaw. I got the Texans' enormous order grilled up and dispensed, and still, the man at the counter had not made his selection. He gave Prue a run for her money in the wishy-washy department. While Monsieur Wishy-Washy was studying the menu board as if it contained all the vast secrets of the universe, Hank came over and started filling me in on the local gossip. Apparently, the new and improved municipal fireworks display had hit a snag. Several of the key rockets, worth upwards of $1,000 each and highly dangerous in the hands of an amateur, had been stolen from the Parks Department storage. Apparently, the community of Bray Bay was destined to be deprived of the promised spectacular come Independence Day. My conversation with Hank was interrupted by the youngest Texan's request for ketchup. I'd always thought Lone Star Staters were partial to barbecue sauce, but this little longhorn was set on ketchup and unprepared to accept any substitute. We usually keep at least half a dozen squeeze bottles of ketchup around, but a quick survey of the tables yielded nothing. Neither were there any bottles of ketchup on the stainless steel counter in front of the food truck window, although there were 2 $20 bills tucked under the napkin dispenser. In the end, I had to resort to spooning a mound of ketchup into a paper bowl. We still possessed a full contingent of regular mustard, hot mustard, mayo, relish, and barbecue sauce, but every last one of the red squeeze bottles containing ketchup had vanished into the ether. You guys leave some money on the counter? I asked as I set the paper bowl down on the table. I could tell the Texans thought I was touched in the head. What kind of burger joint didn't have ketchup at the ready, and what kind of businesswoman didn't keep track of 20s? While I was dealing with the ketchup shortage, Monsieur Wishy-Washy had evidently cracked under the strain of too many choices and taken off because when I looked around for him, he was pulling out of the parking lot. You know who that man was? I asked Hank as he wound up his story of the filched fireworks. That guy who just drove off in the maroon sedan? Yeah, that was Dr. Smith. Sidney Smith. Never saw him before in my life, I said. Well, you wouldn't have had any call to have any dealings with him, Hank said. He's a pediatrician. I only know who he is because my wife and I used to take our kids to see him. I always got the impression he wasn't very social. Not antisocial, exactly. More like he was shy. By closing time, I'd gotten a text from Tanisha saying she was off work at 6. I asked her to meet me at 8 at the coffee shop around the corner from Whispering Palms. I didn't tell Arnie that I was meeting Tanisha. I hadn't even told him that Antonio was going around telling people he'd put horse poo in his pizza oven. Tanisha was waiting for me at a table in a quiet corner when I arrived. I know what Antonio is saying about your cook, she said as soon as I sat down. That's typical of him, I'm afraid, but I wouldn't worry too much. He lies all the time, so nobody who knows him puts much faith in anything he says. But people who didn't know Antonio did believe him, I wanted to say. They had no reason not to. Antonio had managed to lie a whole slew of seniors out of hundreds of thousands of dollars before anyone had put a stop to it, which brought me to my main question. Is your father the one who exposed Antonio's bogus Costa Rican condominium scheme? Tanisha nodded stiffly. I know this is super personal, but is that why you guys broke up? That was just the straw that broke the camel's back. Tanisha looked like she could have said a lot more, but she fell silent. I didn't blame her. I wouldn't spill my guts to a perfect stranger either. Antonio told me he used to be married to Arnie's sister, Hannah. Is that true? I really ought to be asking Arnie that question or asking Hannah, but I lacked the nerve. Yes. Hannah was wife number 2. Were you number 1 or 3? 4. Oh. I didn't know what to say to that. Antonio looked to be barely 30. If he'd first married at 20, that worked out to a new wife every 2.5 years. It was impossible to chalk that up to bad luck unless you looked at it from his ex-wives' perspectives. It certainly had been unlucky for them. Why is Antonio back in Bray Bay? I asked Tanisha. Does he have family here? Tanisha was silent for a long time before she answered. He wants us to get back together, she said. At least that's what he tells me. He says that's why he opened up a business next to Whispering Palms, so he can see me every day. But why a food truck? That was his dad's idea, Tanisha said. Antonio is pretty much broke and unemployable, so his dad bought him that food truck. The Scarpello family are all in the restaurant business, and cooking is one of the few things that Antonio is actually good at unless you count conning people. By the way, I asked Tanisha as I rose to leave, what's your dad's name? Sydney Smith, she said. Most people call him Dr. Smith, though, because half the people under 50 in this town used to have him as their pediatrician. After I went home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about Antonio and trying to figure out what he was up to. I was confident that Antonio was no long-term threat to my business, but I was far from certain that he was no short-term threat to Arnie or, indeed, the residents of Whispering Palms. Antonio claimed he was camped out next door to Whispering Palms because he wanted to get back together with his ex-wife, but I wasn't so sure. Tanisha was so completely over Antonio that she was happily engaged to another man. Besides, Antonio didn't seem the type to fixate on any one woman, especially one who was so clearly onto his tricks. What if Antonio was positioning himself to launch some new scheme to bilk a fresh crop of seniors out of their life savings? It was exceedingly odd to be giving out stock tips with pizzas. I couldn't help suspecting that the slimy lizard was priming the population of Whispering Palms to view him as some financially savvy guru. I was betting Antonio's investment advice wasn't nearly as good as his pizzas were. I was on time the next morning, which was fortunate because Arnie hadn't shown up. Arnie is the picture of punctuality, so when he still hadn't arrived by 11:30 and hadn't answered any of my texts, I was starting to worry. I was putting ketchup into a whole new set of red plastic squeeze bottles that I'd fetched from the backup supplies I keep stashed in my garage at home when Hannah drove up. You'd better sit down for this, she said. I went hot and cold. I felt like I'd swallowed a brick. Was Arnie dead? Had he been in some terrible accident? Was he lying in a hospital bed in a coma? Arnie's been arrested, Hannah told me. Chapter 6. Arrested? My voice sounded high and weirdly hoarse. Why has Arnie been arrested? Antonio claims Arnie beat him up. I knew Arnie hated Antonio, but I found it hard to wrap my mind around Arnie becoming violent. Do you think it's true? I asked Hannah. I don't know, she hesitated. I don't want to believe it, but if Arnie didn't beat up Antonio, someone else did. You've seen him? Arnie? Yes. I had stopped by his house this morning to pick up something Sammy had left behind when the police came to arrest him. I'll be able to post bail for him this afternoon. I meant, have you seen Antonio? You seem so sure that someone attacked him. I did see Antonio, Hannah said. After Arnie was arrested, I went over to Antonio's house to get his side of the story. Antonio isn't seriously injured, but he has a lot of cuts and bruises. There's no question somebody attacked him. It had crossed my mind that Antonio might have dumped his own toppings in the bushes and put horse poo in his own pizza oven, in an attempt to frame Arnie, but injuring oneself badly enough to get somebody arrested was a whole nother level of crazy. Still, I had to ask. Would Antonio be capable of injuring himself just so he could claim someone else did it? I asked. I considered that, too, Hannah told me, but I quickly ruled it out. There's no question Antonio has a terribly twisted mind, but he's also a physical coward. You know how he likes to mountain bike? Well, he tries to project the image of being this tough, adventurous, outdoorsy type, but he's actually super cautious. He goes on and on if he gets even a little scrape and makes it out to be a serious injury. Is it possible that's what he's doing now? Making a big fuss over nothing? I saw him for myself, Hannah said. He's not faking it. He may not have broken any bones, but he has some really nasty bumps and bruises, and they are most definitely not painted on. You know Tanisha is in town, I said. Antonio's ex-wife Tanisha? Hannah said. What about her? Do you know anything about her dad? I understand he lives in Bray Bay. Sydney Smith? I do know him, actually. He's Sammy and Porter's pediatrician. Well, Dr. Smith used to be Sammy and Porter's pediatrician. He retired last year. I guess some of his patients probably thought it was high time he did, considering he's probably pushing 80. What do you think of him? As a pediatrician? He was a fine doctor. I was disappointed when he retired. I meant, what was your impression of him as a person? I have no idea. Our conversations were limited to discussing ear infections and strep throat. Do you think they'll let me see Arnie? I asked Hannah. I doubt it, she said. They took him over to the county jail in Eagles Rest. Visiting hours aren't until 3, and by that time, I expect he'll have made bail. As Hannah got ready to leave, I thought of one more question. Where does Antonio live? He's renting a little house a couple of blocks from Whispering Palms. On Hibiscus Lane. What's the house number? What do you hope to accomplish by confronting him? Hannah asked. I already tried that, and it was a waste of time. Besides, it's very possible that Arnie did beat Antonio up and is too embarrassed to admit it. It would be totally out of character, but heaven knows my brother has plenty of reason to hate Antonio. I have no intention of confronting Antonio, I told Hannah. I do, however, plan to stake out the place. Well, don't you go and get arrested, too. If Antonio catches you at it, I wouldn't put it past him to try and get you charged with stalking and harassment, not to mention trespassing, if you dare to set foot on his lawn. During the lunch hour, several of our Whispering Palm regulars, including Prue and Fitz, came by for burgers. The news that Arnie had been arrested clearly had the Bray Bay rumor mill abuzz. You should see Antonio's face. Looks like someone took a baseball bat to him, Fitz said before Prue shushed him. I guess she thought it insensitive to bring up the subject in front of me. You've seen Antonio? I asked. He looks terrible, Fitz said. I stopped by the pizza truck just to get a look at the damage. Your Arnie sure did a number on him. Wonder why? I didn't think they even knew each other. He's not my Arnie, I protested. At least Arnie gave him fair warning. Fitz chuckled. He appeared to be finding the whole distressing incident highly amusing. Fitz finds a lot of things amusing that don't speak particularly well of his character. What do you mean? I asked. I guess you didn't hear, Prue said. When Patsy was out for her sunrise walk this morning, she saw something written in red on the side of Antonio's pizza truck. What did the warning say? I asked as my heart sunk into my shoes. Chapter 7. I'm not sure what the warning said exactly, Prue told me. It was washed off by the time I got around this morning, but I think Patsy took a picture of it. You should ask her. As soon as the lunch rush was over, I fired down the fry vat, pulled down the shutters on the window, and wrote, back at 4 o'clock, on the chalkboard where Arnie usually writes what the special of the day is. Today there was no special because there was no Arnie. I walked the 3 blocks to Whispering Palms, went straight to the front desk, and asked for the apartment numbers for Patsy Johnson and Sydney Smith. I started with Patsy. My questions for Patsy were straightforward, and I wouldn't have to do a lot of explaining who I was and why I had a right to know. Patsy didn't open the door until I'd knocked for at least a solid minute. I think she'd been napping because she looked a little rumpled and slightly disoriented. I heard you have a picture of the warning somebody wrote on the side of Antonio's food truck. Patsy did have a picture, although it would have been more useful if it hadn't been so blurry. Get out of Bray Bay or else, law. The first part of the phrase was clear, but after the word else, the letters had run so badly that everything in between else and a law was illegible. I could see how the warning could easily be interpreted as being signed by Arnie. It wasn't a stretch to assume that a brother-in preceded law. It could also be father-in-law, or less likely, mother-in-law, or simply some phrase like fear the law. I wondered if any of Antonio's scam victims lived at Whispering Palms. If so, parking his food truck next door certainly would make him an easy target for their ire. Do you know what the words were written with? I asked Patsy. I was curious about that, too, so I walked up and had a closer look. You'll never believe what it was. I was really hoping she wasn't going to say blood. She didn't. It was ketchup, Patsy said. Somebody wrote that message in ketchup. They even left a couple of those big squeeze bottles like the ones you use at your food truck behind. My next interview was a bit stickier. Dr. Smith seemed none too happy to see me. I think he expected me to confront him about stealing my ketchup, which I was 98% certain he had, although, technically, he'd more than paid for it with the $40 he'd left behind. I had no intention of accusing Dr. Smith of ketchup theft. There was too much at stake to get caught up in petty crime. When I explained that my best friend Arnie's sister used to be married to Antonio, and that I was trying to extricate my friend from a vicious smear campaign orchestrated by Dr. Smith's hated ex-son-in-law, he warmed up considerably. When I told Sydney that Antonio was blaming Arnie for dumping out his toppings and putting horse poo in his pizza oven, Dr. Smith started laughing so hard I thought he might pass out. I did all of it, he said when he'd finally regained his composure. In the middle of Dr. Smith's confession, I got a plaintive text from Arnie saying he'd made bail and was heading home to rest. I'm sorry that I can't share your amusement, I told Dr. Smith. Arnie's just bailed out of jail after Antonio had him arrested for assault and battery. Sydney Smith sobered up quickly. If it comes down to confessing to my crimes in order to clear the innocent, I'll do it, and I am sorry about the ketchup. Thank you. Do you think he did it? Do I think Arnie beat up Antonio? My gut says definitely not, but the evidence points to yes. According to everyone who has seen Antonio since the incident, he's genuinely injured. Well, I can't say I haven't ever thought of. Dr. Smith never finished telling me what he hadn't ever thought of doing because we were interrupted by a boom so explosive that the windows of the apartment rattled. Chapter 8. Dr. Smith and I rushed to the window. There was nothing to see, so I hurried outside, Sydney Smith close on my heels. There was a black column of smoke billowing up over the roof of the apartment block we'd just come out of. When we rounded the corner of the building, we had a clear view of the vacant lot next to Whispering Palms. Antonio's mobile pizza kitchen looked like it had been hit by a bomb. Against my better judgment, I rushed over to the smoldering wreckage. The side of the truck was blown out, and bits of metal and glass littered the ground. Antonio. I called out but got no answer. I cautiously approached the blackened truck and looked inside. Thankfully, I didn't see a body, but without poking around, I couldn't be sure. I looked back toward Whispering Palms and saw Sydney Smith standing at a safe distance from the blown-out truck. He was holding his phone to his ear, and I assumed he must be calling 911. Curious residents were peering out of windows, and I watched as Fitzrobinson rounded the corner to investigate. Prue was right behind him, holding her ears as if she expected a secondary explosion any second. Normally, Prue can't be counted on to be logical, but I decided she might be onto something, so I took a step back from the smoking truck. Within minutes the police had arrived, although Officer Finch was not among them, followed by an ambulance. The officers approached the wreckage and determined the ambulance was not needed. Antonio's mobile pizza kitchen had been unoccupied when it blew sky high. Did anybody here see what happened? One of the officers asked the crowd of Whispering Palms residents and staff who'd gathered in little agitated knots around the outskirts of the scene. Lots of people had heard the explosion, but it seemed that no one had seen it. After a while, the crowd started to break up. A lot of the residents were off to senior bingo in the basement of the Baptist church a few blocks away, and Marcella informed me that she had an appointment to get a wash and set. She had a date, apparently, but declined to divulge the identity of the unfortunate gentleman. I wondered where the couple intended to dine. I hoped Marcella didn't take exception to the quality of the service and start flipping tables. I couldn't help wondering where Antonio had been when his food truck exploded. When I'd asked around, there was unanimous agreement that no one had seen Antonio anywhere in the vicinity of Whispering Palms or his food truck, since he'd closed up around one. He told several people he was in too much pain from his injuries to continue working, so he was going home to recuperate. Before I headed off, I sidled up to one of the officers at the scene and asked if they'd pinpointed the source of the explosion. Can't be sure until a team of specialists looks at it, the officer told me, but it looks like it was fireworks? Bottle rockets? Antonio has been giving away a fistful of free bottle rockets with every pizza through the 4th. There do seem to be a bunch of spent bottle rockets, among other things, but I can't imagine a box of bottle rockets doing that kind of damage. Before I headed back to the food truck, I texted Tanisha. Prue had informed me that it was her day off, so I assumed Tanisha might not even know that Antonio's truck had blown to bits. I'll go over to his house and check on him, Tanisha told me. A few minutes later, as I was telling Arnie what had happened, Tanisha called me. You're sure Antonio was telling people he was going home to rest? I asked around, I told her. 5 people all agreed that Antonio closed up shop around 1, said he was going home, and nobody's seen him since. I knocked on his door, Tanisha said, and I swear someone was inside, but nobody answered. He's also not responding to texts or answering his phone. While I was there, a police officer came by looking for Antonio, but he hadn't been able to reach him either. I stuck around the food truck after that to help Arnie deal with the after bingo crowd, but then headed off to the grove down by the beach where the off-road bike park was. I met Marge and Bobby 2 blocks from the beach. You heard about Antonio's pizza truck exploding? I asked. They had. They'd been in the vicinity of Whispering Palms several times that day, but they couldn't recall seeing anything unusual. There is something I wanted to tell you, said Marge. It's about Arnie. Oh. We heard that he got arrested for beating up Antonio, Bobby said, but I don't think that's what actually happened. That made 2 of us. Oh. Our friend Trent saw Antonio in the woods that day before Arnie got arrested. Riding his bike? Wrecking his bike, said Bobby. Trent said Antonio was all busted up. Trent saw him take this jump, but it ended so badly Antonio couldn't even ride his bike back out of the grove. Do you know where I might find Trent? I asked. Marge thought he hung out down by the beach this time of day, so we all went down together to find him. Trent was asleep under a palm tree, but Bobby woke him up. That guy didn't get beat up, Trent said when he'd finished telling the story of seeing Antonio wreck his mountain bike and limp away, not unless you count the beating he took from the stump he came down on. That and the tumble down the slope into the gravel. But I thought Antonio wore a bunch of protective gear, I said. Body armor and a full-face helmet. How did he manage to get so injured? He wasn't wearing any of that stuff, Trent said. It was at least 90, and I guess he decided to do without it. He was wearing a regular bike helmet, but that was it. Would you be willing to repeat everything you said to a police officer? I asked him. Trent said he was prepared to go down to the station with me whenever I wanted. Did Antonio leave with his bike? I asked Trent. I'm not sure, he said. He was pushing it right after he left the jump, but he was having a really hard time, so he might have decided to stash it in the bushes and come back for it later. I decided to look around and see if I could locate the wrecked bicycle before I drove Trent down to the station. Marge, Bobby, Trent, and I split up and searched sections of the shrubby undergrowth at the outskirts of the grove. I was the one who found Antonio's battered bicycle. Can you guys watch this thing until we come back with the police? I asked Bobby and Marge. I wasn't too worried about Antonio coming back to retrieve his bike, and it turned out he had bigger problems on his hands, literally. I drove Trent down to the police station and left him there while I made another stop. Bray Bay Drugstore is on Main Street, so it should have a lot of walk-in traffic, but Mr. Forbes, the man who runs the place, is very old school. He has never tried to diversify. The Bray Bay Drugstore doesn't sell souvenirs, snacks, or magazines. Nobody ever goes there unless they are sick or injured. Mr. Forbes himself was working the counter when I walked in. Besides a young woman in the back who was stocking shelves, we were the only ones in the place. I have an odd question for you, Mr. Forbes, I said. Chapter 9. Mr. Forbes merely grunted in answer to my question. He's never been a man of many words. Did you happen to notice a man about my age come in here a couple of hours ago, tall, muscular, dark-haired? I asked. Possibly with burns or black marks on his clothing? Wasn't here until a few minutes ago, said Mr. Forbes. He gave no explanation for his absence. Who was here earlier? Jessica. Mr. Forbes jerked his thumb toward the back. I repeated my question to Jessica. I don't know about burns, she said, but there was a man who came in here a few hours ago. He was very strange. He insisted that I carry his shopping basket for him. Why? Don't know. He kept his hands in his pockets the whole time. Surely he had to carry his purchases out of the store. No, Jessica told me. He asked me to put them in his car for him. Was he alone? Seemed to be. What did he buy? Jessica hesitated. I suspected she'd been coached by Mr. Forbes that it was imperative she preserve the confidentiality of the clientele, if she wanted to keep her job. Was it supplies to treat burns? I persisted. She looked wordlessly over at Mr. Forbes, who was absorbed with rearranging the display of balms and ointments by the register, then nodded. Before I'd come into the drugstore, I'd texted Hannah and Tanisha and asked if either of them still had a picture of Antonio. Only Hannah had replied, and the picture she had was several years out of date. I showed it to Jessica anyway. This look like him? Jessica was convinced that it was Antonio who'd been in earlier. I walked out on the sidewalk and dialed Officer Finch. It's imperative that you get Antonio in for questioning before the burns have time to heal, I told him without preamble. What burns? Scott said. Did you send some homeless guy down here? He's been talking to Randall for the last half hour. Antonio, or his doppelganger, was in the Bray Bay drugstore shortly after the pizza truck blew up. He was buying supplies to treat burns. He kept his hands in his pockets the whole time and made the drugstore clerk carry his purchases out to the car. So? Maybe he's just a jerk and likes making people wait on him. That was probably not far off the mark, but I doubted that was the only reason Antonio had insisted on keeping his hands in his pockets. I think Antonio blew up his own food truck and tried to make it look like an accident. And? He burned his hands in the process, but he doesn't want anyone to know. Why would he blow up his own truck? I had my theories, but I wasn't ready to share them. Don't you think the fact that Antonio was spotted right after the explosion buying burn supplies and hasn't been seen since is suspicious? It might be, said Scott, if he wasn't down here at the station right now, giving a statement. A statement? He says he doesn't have a clue why the truck blew up, but he seems pretty devastated about it. Crocodile tears. What? Crocodile tears. Antonio's happy that truck blew up. I'd bet my life he did it himself. The only reason he's filing a police report is that's the first step in getting an insurance payout. There was a skeptical silence on the other end of the phone. Just get a look at his hands, I told Scott. Scott hung up, and I wondered if he'd actually do it, but 10 minutes later, he called back. You were right, he said. Can't talk right now, but you were right. It was weeks before the whole mess was sorted out, and Antonio was back behind bars. 2 more witnesses came forward to corroborate Trent's story that Antonio's injuries had been the result of a biking accident, and not being beaten by a bitter ex-brother-in-law. Arnie was cleared of suspicion. The insurance fraud investigation took much longer. Scott told me he'd spent hours poring over security camera footage to establish that Antonio had been at the scene of the explosion. Apparently, Antonio had run a fuse from outside the truck to a large box of bottle rockets laced with the powdered contents of several much larger fireworks. I think Antonio's original plan was to make it look like the box of bottle rockets blew up by accident, but he determined that just a box of bottle rockets wouldn't total the truck, so he upgraded his firepower with the contents of the much larger fireworks stolen from the parks department. Apparently, Antonio had trouble keeping the paper and black powder fuse he'd fashioned to touch off the box of fireworks lit. He tried juicing it up with the contents of several disassembled bottle rockets. That's how he'd burned his hands yet managed to escape getting blown to bits with the truck. What with the far more serious matter of false allegations of assault and battery, not to mention insurance fraud, pretty much everyone but me seemed to have forgotten about the dumped pizza toppings and the horse poo in the pizza oven, so I kept my mouth shut. Dr. Smith ought not to have done what he did, but nobody had gotten hurt in the process. I couldn't really blame Sidney Smith for taking drastic, albeit slightly daft, measures to try and drive his ex-son-in-law away from Bray Bay. If I had a daughter, I sure wouldn't want Antonio anywhere near her. The day we heard Antonio was back behind bars, our regulars from Whispering Palms made something of a public apology. I didn't know what to think when nearly 100 retirees showed up at the food truck. They couldn't all be there for burgers and fries. They were also oddly quiet and orderly. There was none of the usual jostling and grumbling about who had cut who in line. "We have something to say," Prue announced after she was ushered to the front of the pack. But then she didn't say anything more. Instead, she motioned to Patsy and Flo, who unfurled an enormous banner that read, "Felicia and Arnie, best burgers south of the state line, endorsed by the old fogies of Whispering Palms." "We all helped," said Prue. The lettering was crooked, and the banner appeared to have been constructed out of an old shower curtain, but it was just about the sweetest thing I'd ever seen. "Fries on the house for everyone," I said before Arnie could stop me. "Absolutely not," Patsy said. "Today, anyone who doesn't pay full price for their food has to call every Baptist church senior bingo game for the next 6 months." "Is that so bad?" I had to ask. "It is," said Prue under her breath. "Marcella Edwards has started carrying rotten produce in her purse," Patsy added, "and she throws it at the caller when they pick any number she doesn't have on her card." "We tried to get the Baptists to ban her," Fitz chimed in, "but Marcella has the church board convinced the rest of us are picking on her." I got so fed up that I invited the pastor to be our guest bingo caller, so I'm afraid it's only a matter of time before Elder Pritchett gets a moldy orange to the head. I felt a little sorry for Pastor Pritchett. He was no match for the Whispering Palms mob. No one was. I had to admit it felt good to know the senior citizens of Bray Bay were, for the moment, at least, solidly on my side. They were a force to be reckoned with. The end.